Marcus Whitfield froze mid-step, his weathered hand gripping the rifle as a sound pierced the morning silence of the Smoky Mountains, a low, agonized groan that made his blood run cold. It wasn't the call of any wild animal he'd heard in 30 years of forest patrol. The sound came again, weaker this time, carrying a heartbreaking familiarity that sent him stumbling through the underbrush toward its source. What he found beneath the ancient oak made him drop to his knees. Benny, the bear cub he'd rescued 8 years ago, lay trapped in a massive steel contraption, his hind leg mangled and bleeding, the distinctive star-shaped scar on his forehead barely visible through matted fur. The gentle giant who had never forgotten the man who saved him looked up with eyes filled with pain and impossible trust. "Jesus Christ," Marcus whispered, his hands trembling as he reached for the blood-soaked metal. Who would do this to an innocent creature? And why did those fresh tire tracks lead away from the trap like someone had been watching, waiting? Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments along with the city you're watching from now. Let's continue with the story. 8 years earlier, Marcus Whitfield had been a different man. Back then, he wore the crisp uniform of a senior park ranger, his days filled with purpose and his nights warmed by Sarah's laughter echoing through their cabin. Their daughter Emma would race through these same woods, her pigtails bouncing as she chased fireflies, while Sarah would call out, "Don't go too far, sweetheart." The memory of that voice still haunted every trail he walked. The accident changed everything. One rainy October evening, a drunk driver had stolen his entire world in a matter of seconds. Sarah and Emma never made it home from Emma's piano recital. Marcus found himself alone in a cabin that felt too big, too quiet, too full of ghosts. He took early retirement at 55, unable to bear the pitying looks from colleagues who whispered about poor Mac Whitfield behind his back. That's when he found Benny, a tiny malnourished cub barely 3 months old, abandoned near the old logging road. The mother bear had likely been killed by poachers, leaving her baby to starve. Marcus should have called wildlife services, should have followed protocol. Instead, he carried the whimpering cub home and spent sleepless nights bottle-feeding him, nursing him back to health with the same desperate tenderness he'd once lavished on Emma's scraped knees. "You're gonna make it, little guy," he'd whispered during those long nights. And somehow saying those words helped him believe he might make it too. When Benny grew strong enough to return to the wild, Marcus carved a small star into his forehead. Gentle, painless, just enough to always recognize him. "So I'll know you're one of the good ones," he'd said, releasing the young bear back into the forest. But Benny never truly left. Over the years, Marcus would glimpse him through the trees, always watching, always nearby. Sometimes he'd find gifts, a perfect pine cone on his porch, wildflowers arranged in a small bouquet by his door. Neighbors thought he was losing his mind when he mentioned it. "Bears don't leave presents, Mac," they'd say with concerned smiles, but Marcus knew better. Benny remembered. In a world that had forgotten kindness, that innocent creature somehow understood love. Now, staring down at his broken friend caught in this monstrous trap, Marcus felt something he hadn't experienced since the accident, a purpose beyond his own grief. His hands moved swiftly, expertly examining the trap's mechanism. The steel jaws had bitten deep, but they'd missed the major arteries. There was still time. "Easy, boy," he murmured, the same gentle tone he'd used all those years ago. "I'm here to help you, just like before." Benny's massive head lifted slightly, and in those pain-filled eyes, Marcus saw something that made his throat tighten. Trust. After 8 years in the wild, after this betrayal by human cruelty, Benny still trusted him completely. The sound of approaching footsteps made Marcus's blood freeze. Someone was coming through the woods, and they weren't trying to be quiet about it. The footsteps crashed through the underbrush with desperate urgency, and Marcus instinctively reached for his rifle. When the figure emerged from behind a cluster of birch trees, Marcus nearly pulled the trigger in shock. It was Tommy Brennan, the same farmer he'd helped 3 years ago when vandals had destroyed Tommy's chicken coops. But this wasn't the grateful, hard-working man Marcus remembered. This Tommy looked haggard, desperate, his clothes dirty and his eyes wild with something that made Marcus's stomach clench. "Step away from the bear, Mac." Tommy's voice cracked as he raised an old hunting rifle, his hands trembling so badly the barrel wavered. "I'm real sorry, but you gotta step away right now." Marcus slowly straightened, keeping his hands visible but not moving away from Benny. "Tommy, what the hell are you doing out here? Did you set this trap? Don't make this harder than it has to be." Tommy's face crumpled, and tears started streaming down his cheeks. "Please, Mac, you helped me before, and I'll never forget that kindness. But I can't let you interfere this time." "Interfere with what?" Marcus kept his voice calm, the way he'd learned to speak to panicked hikers over the years. "Tommy, this is Benny. He's not hurting anybody. He's been living peacefully in these woods for 8 years. You don't understand." Tommy's voice rose to a near shriek. "My boy, my Jake. He's dying, Mac. Leukemia. The doctors say he needs a bone marrow transplant, but the insurance won't cover it. I owe the hospital $300,000, and they're going to stop his treatment if I don't pay." The words hit Marcus like a physical blow. He remembered Jake, a bright-eyed boy of about Emma's age when Marcus had last seen him. "Jesus, Tommy, I'm sorry. I had no idea. But what does that have to do with—" "Bear bile," Tommy whispered, the words barely audible. "There's a black market for it. Asian medicine. They pay $50,000 for a live bear's gallbladder. 50,000, Mac. That's enough to keep Jake in treatment for another 6 months. Marcus felt sick. "You're talking about killing him, killing Benny." "You think I want to?" Tommy screamed, spittle flying from his lips. "You think I sleep at night knowing what I'm planning? But it's one bear against my son's life. What would you do, Mac? What would any father do?" The question hung in the air like a physical weight. Marcus thought of Emma, of the lengths he would have gone to save her if he'd had the chance. But this was different. This was Benny. Innocent, trusting Benny who had never hurt a soul. "There has to be another way," Marcus said quietly. "Tommy, listen to me." The sound of approaching vehicles cut him off. Through the trees, Marcus could see black SUVs moving slowly along the old logging road. Tommy's eyes went wide with panic. "They're early," he whispered. "They weren't supposed to be here for another hour." "Who wasn't supposed to be here?" Marcus demanded. But Tommy was already grabbing his arm, pulling him behind a fallen log. "Get down. If they see you here, they'll kill us both." Marcus crouched reluctantly, his mind racing. "Tommy, who are those people?" "The buyers," Tommy said, his voice hollow. "They're not just buying the bile, Mac. They're buying the whole operation. This isn't my idea. I'm just the muscle. They've got bigger plans for this forest." 3 men in expensive suits emerged from the SUVs, their shoes completely inappropriate for hiking through wilderness. The man in the lead was tall, silver-haired, and carried himself with the confidence of someone used to being obeyed. Marcus didn't recognize him, but something about the way the other men deferred to him suggested serious money and serious power. "Where's our merchandise, Brennan?" the silver-haired man called out in a crisp, educated accent that didn't belong in these mountains. Tommy stood up slowly, his rifle hanging loose in his hands. "Right here, Mr. Morrison, just like we discussed." Morrison. Marcus's blood turned to ice. John Morrison III, the billionaire developer who'd been trying to buy up land around the national park for the past 5 years. What was he doing here? "Excellent," Morrison said, approaching the trap where Benny lay bleeding. "A fine specimen. My associates in Hong Kong will be very pleased." This is about more than bear bile, Marcus whispered to himself, pieces clicking into place. Morrison didn't need $50,000. This was about something bigger. Morrison knelt beside the trap, studying Benny with the clinical detachment of a man examining a piece of machinery. You know, Brennan, bears can be dangerous creatures, unpredictable. Sometimes they attack without provocation. Sometimes they kill innocent people who are just trying to enjoy nature. Tommy's face went pale. What are you talking about? Morrison smiled, a cold, calculating expression that made Marcus's skin crawl. I'm talking about justification, my dear boy. Public safety. When people hear about bear attacks, they support bear control measures. And when bears become a public safety hazard, well, certain environmental protections become negotiable. The full scope of Morrison's plan hit Marcus like a freight train. This wasn't about money, it was about land. Morrison wanted to build his resort empire in the heart of the national forest, and he was going to use Benny's death to justify removing the protected status that stood in his way. Marcus watched in horror as Morrison's true plan unfolded before his eyes. The billionaire wasn't just buying bear bile, he was orchestrating an elaborate scheme to strip away the environmental protections that had safeguarded these mountains for decades. Tommy's face had gone ashen as the reality of what he'd gotten involved in began to sink in. You said this was just about the bile, Tommy stammered, his rifle shaking in his hands. You said it was a one-time thing to help with Jake's medical bills. Morrison's laugh was as cold as winter wind through bare branches. Oh, Mr. Brennan, you sweet, naive man. Did you really think I'd pay you $50,000 for one bear's gallbladder? I can buy bear bile from any number of suppliers for a fraction of that cost. He gestured toward the forest around them. This is about progress. This is about bringing prosperity to a region that's been locked in environmental red tape for far too long. Marcus felt his hands clench into fists. He'd heard Morrison's speeches on the local news, promises of jobs, tourism revenue, economic development, but seeing the man in person, watching him callously examine Benny like a piece of equipment, Marcus understood the true cost of that progress. The casino resort I'm planning will bring thousands of jobs to this area, Morrison continued, his voice taking on the practiced cadence of a politician. But first, we need to demonstrate that the current wildlife management policies are inadequate. A few tragic bear attacks, some safety concerns, and suddenly the public will be demanding action. Tommy's voice came out as a whisper. You're talking about killing people. I'm talking about controlled incidents, Morrison replied smoothly. Carefully staged encounters that will appear to be bear attacks. With the right documentation, the right witnesses, the right media coverage, public opinion will shift dramatically. Environmental groups will find their support evaporating overnight. Marcus couldn't stay hidden any longer. The thought of Morrison using Benny, gentle, trusting Benny, as the centerpiece of such a monstrous plan made his vision blur with rage. He started to rise from behind the fallen log, but Tommy's hand shot out and grabbed his arm. Don't, Tommy hissed. He's got men with guns. Real professionals, not farmers with hunting rifles. As if summoned by Tommy's words, two more figures emerged from the SUVs. These weren't businessmen in suits. They were military contractors, their movements precise, and their eyes constantly scanning for threats. Marcus recognized the type from his years dealing with poachers. These men killed for money, and they were very good at their jobs. Now, about our timeline, Morrison was saying to Tommy. I need this bear transported to the staging area by tomorrow night. My team will handle the rest of the operation from there. What staging area? Tommy asked, his voice barely audible. Morrison smiled that cold smile again. The Willowbrook Trail, where the morning hiking groups gather, very popular with families, lots of children. He paused, letting the implications sink in. Tragic, really. when a rogue bear attacks innocent hikers, the kind of incident that demands immediate action from wildlife authorities. Marcus felt sick to his stomach. Willowbrook Trail was where he used to take Emma on weekend hikes. Dozens of families used that trail every morning, trusting that the forest was a safe place for their children to explore and learn about nature. But it was Tommy's reaction that surprised Marcus the most. The desperate farmer suddenly straightened, his grip tightening on his rifle. "No," he said quietly. "No, I won't be part of hurting kids." Morrison's expression didn't change, but his voice took on a dangerous edge. "I'm afraid you don't have a choice, Mr. Brennan. You see, you're already complicit in this operation. You set the trap, you captured the bear. If this operation fails, if word gets out about what we're planning, you'll be the one the authorities come after first." "You're threatening me," Tommy said, his voice growing stronger. "I'm stating facts," Morrison replied. "Your son needs expensive medical treatment. You need money. I'm offering you a way to get that money, but the offer comes with certain obligations." Marcus watched Tommy's face cycle through a dozen emotions: fear, anger, desperation, resignation. But then something shifted, and Marcus saw something he recognized from his own dark nights after the accident. The moment when a man decides he'd rather face the consequences of doing right than live with the guilt of doing wrong. "Get away from the bear," Tommy said, raising his rifle and pointing it directly at Morrison. Morrison didn't flinch. "Mr. Brennan, I don't think you understand the gravity of your situation. My associates are armed professionals. You're a farmer with an old hunting rifle. This isn't a fight you can win." "Maybe not," Tommy said, his voice steady now. "But my boy Jake always told me that heroes are just regular people who choose to do the right thing when it matters most. Maybe it's time I tried being his hero instead of his shame." The tension in the clearing was electric. Morrison's men had their hands hovering near concealed weapons. Tommy had his rifle trained on their boss, and Marcus was calculating whether he could reach his own gun before the shooting started. Then, from somewhere in the forest behind them, came a sound that made everyone freeze, the deep, rumbling call of an adult bear, then another, and another. Morrison's confident expression flickered for the first time. "How many bears are in this area?" Marcus felt a grim smile tug at his lips. Benny hadn't been living alone in these woods. He'd been living with a family that had just realized one of their own was in danger. The forest erupted with the sounds of approaching bears, deep huffs, the crack of breaking branches, and the thunderous footfalls of massive animals moving through the underbrush with surprising speed. Morrison's confident demeanor cracked as his head whipped around, trying to locate the source of the sounds that seemed to be coming from every direction. "How many bears did you say lived in this area?" Morrison snapped at Tommy, his polished composure finally showing cracks. Tommy's eyes were wide with shock. I don't know. I only knew about the one in the trap." Marcus knew exactly what was happening. Benny hadn't been living alone. He'd found a family, or perhaps a family had found him. Black bears weren't typically social animals, but Marcus had heard stories from other rangers about unusual groups forming around particularly intelligent individuals. Benny's gentle nature and strange intelligence had apparently attracted other bears seeking the same peaceful coexistence he represented. "Boss, we need to move," one of Morrison's security contractors said urgently, his hand resting on the grip of a concealed pistol. "Multiple large predators, unknown numbers. This situation is escalating beyond our control parameters." But Morrison was no longer listening to his hired muscle. His face had gone red with fury as he realized his carefully orchestrated plan was falling apart. 30 years I've been working toward this moment," he snarled. 30 years of buying politicians, bribing officials, and waiting for the perfect opportunity to unlock this land's potential. I won't let a bunch of dumb animals ruin everything now. He pulled out a chrome-plated revolver and pointed it directly at Benny's head. "If we can't stage a proper attack, we'll just have to make do with a dead bear and a story about self-defense." "No!" Tommy and Marcus shouted simultaneously, but Morrison's finger was already tightening on the trigger. That's when Marcus saw something that made his heart stop. Through the trees, barely visible in the dappled sunlight, was a small figure in a red hoodie, moving toward the commotion with the fearless curiosity that only belonged to children. "Jake!" Tommy screamed, recognizing his son at the same moment Marcus did. The 12-year-old boy stepped into the clearing, his face lighting up when he saw his father. "Dad, I've been looking everywhere for you. The nice lady at the wildlife center said you might be—" His words died as he took in the scene. The trapped bear, the men with guns, the palpable tension crackling through the air. Morrison's eyes fixed on the boy with predatory interest. Well, well, this might work out even better than planned. Nothing quite like an eyewitness to a tragic bear attack. Jake's gaze fell on Benny, and his expression changed completely. The fear left his face, replaced by something that looked almost like recognition. "It's him," the boy whispered, taking a step toward the trapped bear despite the guns pointed in his direction. "It's the bear who saved me." "What are you talking about?" Tommy demanded, his rifle now swinging between Morrison and his own son, unsure which posed the greater threat. Jake's voice was filled with wonder as he spoke. 3 weeks ago, when I ran away from the foster home to try to find Grandma Marty, I got lost in the woods, and it was getting dark, and I was so scared. Then this bear found me. This same bear, I can tell by the scar on his forehead. He didn't hurt me. He led me to safety. He brought me to the Wildlife Rehabilitation Center." Marcus felt his world shift. "Foster home. Tommy, where's Jake been living?" Tommy's face crumpled with shame. "When I lost the farm, when the medical bills got too high, social services said I couldn't provide adequate care. They placed him in temporary foster care while I tried to get back on my feet. That's why I was so desperate for money. I need to prove I can support him if I want him back." But Jake wasn't paying attention to the adult conversation. He was slowly approaching Benny, his small hands extended in a gesture of comfort that made Morrison's face twist with rage. "Get away from that animal, you stupid child!" Morrison snarled, raising his gun toward Jake. That's when the forest exploded into motion. 3 adult bears burst into the clearing simultaneously. A massive male that had to weigh over 400 pounds, a smaller but equally formidable female, and a younger bear that looked like it might be one of Benny's siblings. Their arrival wasn't random. They moved with purpose, positioning themselves between the humans and their trapped family member. Morrison's security contractors immediately drew their weapons, but found themselves facing an impossible tactical situation. The bears had surrounded them, and any shot that missed could hit one of the civilians in the clearing. "Stand down!" one of the contractors shouted to his partner. "Too many variables, too much crossfire risk." But Morrison had lost all rational thought. "I don't care about variables," he screamed. "Kill them all! Kill the bears, kill the witnesses, kill everyone. I'll spin it as a mass bear attack, a tragedy that proves we need to clear this entire forest." In that moment, Marcus understood that Morrison had crossed the line from greed into genuine madness. 30 years of frustrated ambition had finally broken whatever humanity the man had once possessed. Tommy was the first to move. With a father's protective instinct overriding all other considerations, he lunged toward Jake, trying to put himself between his son and Morrison's gun. The movement broke the standoff like a dam bursting. Morrison fired wildly, the shot going high and wide. The bears responded to the gunshot with roars that shook the ground, but instead of attacking, they did something that stunned everyone present. They began moving in a coordinated pattern, herding the humans away from Benny while keeping themselves between the guns and the trapped bear. Marcus used the chaos to reach his own rifle, but found himself facing an agonizing choice. He could take a clear shot at Morrison, but the man was now using Jake as a human shield, his arm wrapped around the boy's throat. "Nobody moves!" Morrison shrieked, his gun pressed against Jake's temple. "I'm walking out of here with the boy, and if anyone follows me, his blood will be on your hands." Jake's voice was small but clear. "Dad, it's okay." "I'm not scared." But Tommy was terrified enough for both of them. "Please," he begged Morrison, "take me instead. The boy's been through enough. I'm the one who helped you. I'm the one you need to silence. Leave Jake out of this." Morrison's laugh was the sound of sanity completely snapping. "Oh, but don't you see? This is perfect. The boy dies in a tragic bear attack. The grieving father seeks revenge by hunting down the responsible animals, and I get to play the heroic developer who steps in to make sure such tragedies never happen again." That's when something extraordinary happened. Jake looked directly at Benny, trapped and bleeding in the steel jaws, and began speaking in a soft, calm voice that carried clearly through the clearing. "It's okay, friend," Jake said to the bear. "I know you remember me. I know you're scared and hurt, but it's going to be all right. My dad and Marcus are good people, and they're going to help you. Just like you helped me when I was lost and scared." Benny's massive head turned toward the boy, and despite his pain, despite the chaos surrounding them, the bear made a sound, a low, rumbling vocalization that sounded almost like purring. "The boy's talking to it," one of Morrison's contractors whispered in amazement. "The damn bear is actually responding." Jake continued speaking, his young voice filled with a wisdom that seemed impossible for his age. "You don't have to be afraid of the bad man with the gun. You've got your family here, and they love you. Just like my dad loves me, even when he makes mistakes trying to take care of me." Morrison's grip on Jake tightened. "Enough of this Disney movie nonsense. Bears are animals, not people. They don't understand love or family or any other human sentiment." But as Morrison spoke, something was happening in the forest around them. More bears were arriving, not just Benny's immediate family, but what appeared to be an entire community. Old bears and young ones, mothers with cubs, solitary males who normally avoided contact with others. They emerged from the trees like shadows materializing into solid form, all of them focused on the trapped member of their unlikely extended family. Marcus had never seen anything like it in 3 decades of working with wildlife. Bears simply didn't behave this way, except that they were behaving this way right in front of his eyes. "Jesus Christ," Tommy whispered. "How many of them are there?" The answer became clear as more and more bears materialized from the forest. At least a dozen, possibly more, all of them maintaining a respectful distance but clearly united in purpose. Morrison's face had gone pale as he realized he was no longer dealing with a simple business transaction gone wrong. He was facing something that challenged everything he thought he knew about the natural world. And in the center of it all, Jake continued talking to Benny in that impossibly calm voice, building a bridge between species with nothing more than a child's pure heart and unshakable faith in the goodness of all living things. The standoff stretched like a taut wire ready to snap. Morrison held Jake against him, the gun trembling at the boy's temple while a dozen bears formed an increasingly tight circle around the clearing. Marcus could see the sweat beading on Morrison's forehead despite the cool mountain air, his carefully maintained composure cracking under the pressure of facing something his money and influence couldn't control. "This is impossible," Morrison muttered, his eyes darting between the bears. "Animals don't behave like this. They don't organize, they don't coordinate attacks. But Marcus knew better. He'd spent enough time in these woods to understand that nature had its own logic, its own sense of community and protection. What they were witnessing wasn't supernatural, it was simply the power of a creature who had learned to bridge the gap between human and animal worlds, inspiring others to do the same. Jake's small voice cut through the tension like a silver thread. "They're not attacking, mister. Can't you see? They're protecting. Just like you're trying to protect your business and my dad was trying to protect me." Morrison's laugh was brittle, edged with hysteria. "A child's fairy tale. Bears are predators, boy. They kill and eat and survive. That's all they do." "That's all you do," Jake replied with the devastating honesty that only children possess. "But they're better than that. They choose to be better." The words hit Morrison like a physical blow, and Marcus saw something dangerous flicker in the man's eyes. 30 years of justifying his actions, of telling himself that progress required sacrifice, that the strong naturally dominated the weak, all of it challenged by a 12-year-old boy who saw the world with clearer eyes than any adult in the clearing. "Shut up!" Morrison snarled, pressing the gun harder against Jake's head. "Shut up with your childish nonsense." That's when Tommy made his move. With a father's desperate courage, he dropped his rifle and raised his hands in surrender. "Morrison, listen to me. You want to walk away from this? Fine, take me. I'm the one who can tie you to this operation. I'm the one who knows about your plans. The boy doesn't know anything." "Dad, no," Jake whispered. But Tommy was already walking forward, his hands clearly visible. "I'll go with you willingly," Tommy continued, his voice steady despite the fear Marcus could see in his eyes. "I'll sign any statement you want, say whatever you need me to say, but let my son go. He's been through enough." Morrison's eyes gleamed with calculating interest. "You'd sacrifice yourself for the boy?" "Without hesitation," Tommy replied. "That's what fathers do." For a moment Morrison seemed to consider the offer, but then his gaze fell on Benny, still trapped and bleeding, and his expression hardened again. "It's too late for deals, Brennan. This situation has spiraled beyond damage control. The only way to salvage my investment is to eliminate all witnesses and frame this as a tragic wildlife attack." Marcus felt his blood turn to ice. Morrison wasn't just threatening Jake and Tommy, he was planning to kill everyone in the clearing and use their deaths to justify his assault on the forest. "You're talking about murdering a child," Marcus said, his voice low and deadly. "That crosses every line, Morrison. Even your hired guns won't go along with that." But when Marcus looked at Morrison's security contractors, he saw men who had clearly crossed similar lines before. They stood ready to follow orders, no matter how monstrous. Morrison raised his gun toward the sky and fired a shot that echoed through the forest like thunder. The bears shifted restlessly at the sound, but they didn't retreat. If anything, they seemed to move closer, their massive forms creating an even tighter circle around the humans. "You see?" Morrison shouted, his voice cracking with strain. "One gunshot and they should have scattered. Instead, they're surrounding us like they're planning something. This proves everything I've been saying about the danger these animals represent." Jake looked up at Morrison with eyes that held no fear, only pity. "They're not surrounding us because they want to hurt us. They're surrounding us because they're trying to protect Benny. Can't you see the difference?" But Morrison was beyond seeing anything clearly. 30 years of frustrated ambition had finally broken whatever restraint he'd once possessed. "I've spent my entire adult life working toward this moment," he snarled. "I've bought politicians, bribed officials, destroyed competitors, all to get access to this land. I won't let a bunch of animals and bleeding hearts stop me now." He gestured to his contractors with his free hand. "Kill the bears. All of them. We'll say they attacked us, that we barely escaped with our lives. But before the contractors could draw their weapons, something extraordinary happened. The largest male bear, the massive 400-pound giant who seemed to be the leader of the group, stepped forward and did something that made everyone in the clearing freeze in astonishment. He sat down. It was such a simple action, such a fundamentally non-threatening gesture, that it completely diffused the tension Morrison had been trying to build. One by one, the other bears followed suit, settling onto their haunches in a massive circle around the humans. They looked less like a pack of predators and more like an audience gathering for a performance. "What are they doing?" one of the contractors whispered, his hand frozen halfway to his weapon. Marcus understood. These bears had learned something from Benny, something about the power of non-violence, about choosing peace over aggression even in the face of threat. They were showing Morrison and his men that strength didn't have to mean violence. Jake seemed to understand too. He looked at each bear in turn, then raised his small voice to address them directly. "Thank you for coming to help Benny. Thank you for not hurting the scared man with the gun, even though he wants to hurt you." Morrison's face went purple with rage. "This is insane. They're animals. They don't understand what you're saying." But as Jake spoke, something remarkable happened. Benny, despite his pain and the steel trap crushing his leg, began to make soft vocalizations, gentle huffs and low rumbles that seemed almost like responses to the boy's words. The other bears picked up the sounds, creating a chorus of peaceful communication that filled the forest with something that could only be described as harmony. "They're talking to each other," Tommy whispered in amazement. "They're actually communicating." Morrison's grip on Jake loosened slightly as he stared at the impossible scene unfolding around him. For just a moment, Marcus saw something flicker across the man's face, not fear or anger, but wonder, as if some long-buried part of his humanity was recognizing something beautiful and pure in what he was witnessing. But the moment passed, and Morrison's expression hardened again. "Enough," he said, raising his gun toward Benny. "If I can't have this land, if I can't build my resort, then I'll at least have the satisfaction of destroying what's stopping me." That's when Jake did something that changed everything. He looked directly at Morrison, and with the fearless honesty that only children possess, he said, "You're not really angry at the bears, are you? You're angry at yourself." Morrison's hand stopped, the gun wavering in his grip. "What did you say?" "My dad told me about you," Jake continued, his young voice filled with compassion that seemed impossible given his circumstances. "You lost your little girl to cancer. That's why you want to build the hospital, isn't it? You think if you build something big enough, important enough, it'll make up for not being able to save her." The color drained from Morrison's face. "How could you possibly know about Elizabeth?" "Because you have the same look in your eyes that my dad gets when he talks about not being able to afford my treatments," Jake said gently. "You're scared and hurt and angry, and you're trying to fix it the only way you know how. But hurting innocent creatures won't bring your daughter back. It'll just make the hole in your heart bigger." Morrison's gun hand began to shake violently. "You don't understand anything, child. You don't know what it's like to lose a daughter, to watch her fade away while you stand helpless." "No," Jake agreed. "But I know what it's like to be sick and scared, and I know what it's like to have a parent who would do anything to save me. Your little girl wouldn't want you to hurt other families. She'd want you to help them, the way you wish someone could have helped her." Tears began streaming down Morrison's face, 30 years of suppressed grief finally breaking through the wall of anger and ambition he'd built around his heart. The gun in his hand dropped to his side as his legs gave out, and he collapsed to his knees, still holding Jake but no longer as a hostage, now clinging to the boy like a lifeline. "Elizabeth," he whispered. "My sweet Elizabeth." She was only 6 years old. She loved animals. She wanted to be a veterinarian when she grew up. Jake gently patted Morrison's arm with the unconscious kindness of a child comforting a crying adult. She sounds wonderful. I bet she's proud of you for stopping before you did something you couldn't take back. The transformation in Morrison was complete and devastating. The powerful billionaire who had terrorized politicians and destroyed competitors was gone, replaced by a broken father who had spent 3 decades trying to outrun his grief and had finally been caught by a child's simple wisdom. Around them the bears began to stir, sensing that the immediate danger had passed. But they didn't leave. Instead, they maintained their vigil, as if understanding that the real work, the work of healing, was just beginning. Marcus looked at the scene before him and felt something shift in his own heart. Here, in this impossible moment, he was witnessing what healing looked like, not the absence of pain, but the choice to transform that pain into something better than revenge. The moment of grace shattered like glass when Morrison's lead contractor, a cold-eyed man named Vance, stepped forward with his weapon drawn. Unlike his employer, he showed no signs of being moved by Jake's words or the extraordinary scene of interspecies communication unfolding around them. "Mr. Morrison," Vance said in a flat, professional tone, "you're experiencing an emotional breakdown. We need to complete the mission and extract immediately." Morrison looked up from where he knelt beside Jake, his face streaked with tears. "The mission is over, Vance. I'm calling it off." "I'm afraid that's not your decision to make anymore, sir." Vance's voice remained eerily calm as he raised his pistol toward Benny. "My orders came from the board of directors. This land acquisition will proceed as planned." Marcus felt his stomach drop as the true scope of Morrison's operation became clear. This wasn't just one man's obsession. It was a corporate conspiracy involving millions of dollars and powerful interests that wouldn't be swayed by a moment of conscience. "The board?" Morrison whispered, his face going pale. "But I am the board. I control the company." Vance's smile was thin and cruel. "Not anymore, Mr. Morrison. Your erratic behavior over the past few months has concerned your major shareholders. They've decided it's time for new leadership. Your emotional instability regarding this project has made you a liability." The second contractor moved to flank the group, and Marcus realized with growing horror that they weren't just here to kill bears. They were here to eliminate Morrison too, along with anyone else who could expose the conspiracy. "You're talking about a corporate coup," Marcus said, his hand moving slowly toward his rifle. "I'm talking about progress," Vance replied. "Mr. Morrison's sentimental attachment to his dead daughter has made him weak. The new leadership understands that sacrifices must be made for the greater good." Jake looked between the adults, his young mind struggling to process the depth of betrayal unfolding around him. But Mr. Morrison changed his mind. He doesn't want to hurt Benny anymore. "Which is exactly why he's no longer useful to the organization," Vance said, swinging his weapon toward Morrison. "Nothing personal, sir, just business." That's when Tommy made a desperate lunge for his dropped rifle, but the second contractor was faster. The gunshot echoed through the forest like thunder, and Tommy crumpled to the ground, clutching his shoulder as blood seeped between his fingers. "Dad!" Jake screamed, breaking free from Morrison's loose grip and running toward his wounded father. The gunshot galvanized the bears. Their peaceful vigil transformed instantly into something far more primal and dangerous. The massive male who had been sitting calmly rose to his full height, nearly 8 feet tall, and let out a roar that shook the ground beneath their feet. Vance spun toward the sound, but he was a man trained for urban warfare, not wilderness survival. He'd never faced a charging grizzly, had never experienced the bone-deep terror of being hunted by a creature that could snap his neck with a casual swipe of its paw. "Jesus Christ," the second contractor whispered, his weapon trembling as more bears rose around them. There's too many of them. We need to abort. But Vance was beyond rational thought now. The careful professionalism that had defined his career cracked under the pressure of facing something his training had never prepared him for. "Kill them all," he snarled. "The bears, the witnesses, everyone. We'll call it a terrorist attack. Blame environmental extremists." Marcus saw his chance. While Vance was focused on the bears, Marcus rolled behind a fallen log and came up with his rifle ready, but before he could take the shot, something incredible happened. Benny, despite the steel trap crushing his leg, despite the blood loss and pain, began struggling to his feet. The massive bear pulled against the trap with strength born of desperation, and Marcus heard the sound of metal beginning to give way under the enormous pressure. "The trap's breaking," Morrison whispered in amazement. "He's actually breaking free." Jake, kneeling beside his wounded father, looked up at Benny with tears streaming down his face. "Come on, friend," he called out. "You're stronger than that mean old trap. You can do it." As if responding to the boy's encouragement, Benny gave one final tremendous pull. The ancient chain that held the trap to the tree snapped with a sound like a gunshot, and suddenly the massive bear was free, though the steel jaws remained clamped around his injured leg. Vance raised his weapon toward the freed bear, but he never got the chance to fire. The lead male, Benny's protector and friend, struck with the lightning speed that only apex predators possess. One massive paw connected with Vance's chest, sending the man flying 20 feet through the air to crash against a tree trunk with a sickening crack. The second contractor dropped his weapon and ran, crashing through the underbrush with the blind panic of a man who had finally understood that money meant nothing when facing the raw power of nature. In the sudden silence that followed, the only sounds were Tommy's labored breathing and the gentle huffing of the bears as they settled back into their protective circle. Benny limped toward Jake and Tommy, his injured leg making each step agony, but his eyes focused entirely on the wounded man and frightened boy. "He's coming to help," Jake whispered, his small hand reaching out toward the approaching bear. Morrison, still on his knees, watched the scene with something approaching reverence. "Elizabeth would have loved this," he said quietly. "She always said animals were better than people because they didn't know how to hate." Marcus emerged from behind the log, his rifle lowered but ready. He could see that Vance was unconscious but breathing, his chest rising and falling in shallow gasps. The immediate threat was over, but Tommy was losing blood and Benny's injuries were severe. "We need to get them both medical attention," Marcus said, kneeling beside Tommy to examine the gunshot wound. "The bullet went through clean, but he's losing too much blood." Jake looked up at Marcus with absolute trust. "Can you help them both?" "Benny and my dad?" Marcus met the boy's eyes and saw something that reminded him powerfully of his own daughter Emma. That unshakable faith that adults could fix anything, that love was stronger than violence, that good would always triumph if brave people were willing to stand up for what was right. "I'm going to try, son," Marcus said. "But I'm going to need your help." Jake nodded solemnly. "What do I need to do?" As Marcus began organizing the rescue effort, using his old ranger training to coordinate medical care for both man and bear, he realized that something fundamental had changed in the forest that day. The bears hadn't just defended Benny, they had defended the idea that different species could coexist, could protect and care for each other across the boundaries that humans insisted were absolute. Morrison pulled out his cell phone with shaking hands. "I'm calling for medical helicopters," he said. "And then I'm calling the FBI. It's time the world knew the truth about what my company has been planning." But even as hope began to bloom in Marcus's chest, he couldn't shake the feeling that this victory had come at too high a cost. Tommy was badly injured, Benny might not survive his wounds, and there were still powerful forces that would stop at nothing to claim this land. The battle for the forest was far from over, The medical helicopters arrived like twin angels descending from heaven, their rotors churning the forest air into a whirlwind of hope and urgency. Marcus watched as paramedics rushed toward Tommy, who lay pale and semi-conscious against a moss-covered boulder. Jake's small hands pressed firmly against his father's shoulder wound to stem the bleeding. "Good job, son," one of the paramedics said to Jake as they took over. "You may have saved your dad's life." But even as the medical team worked on Tommy, Marcus's attention was drawn to Benny, who lay nearby with his massive head resting on the ground, breathing shallow and labored. The steel trap still clamped around his leg like a mechanical parasite, and blood had pooled beneath him in the pine needles. "We need a veterinary team," Marcus called out to the helicopter crew. "This bear needs immediate surgical attention." The lead paramedic looked up from Tommy's stretcher. "Sir, we're only equipped for human casualties." "Wildlife services would need to—" "There's no time," interrupted a voice that made everyone turn. Morrison stood beside the second helicopter, his phone pressed to his ear, his face transformed by determination. "I'm chartering a veterinary emergency response team from the University of Tennessee. They'll be here within the hour." Jake, his small hands now stained with his father's blood, looked up at Morrison with desperate hope. "You're really going to save Benny?" Morrison knelt beside the boy, his expensive suit rumpled and torn from the day's events. "I'm going to try, son. It's the least I can do after everything I've put you and your family through." As Tommy was loaded onto the first helicopter, he grabbed Marcus's hand with surprising strength. "Promise me," he whispered, his voice barely audible over the rotor noise. "Promise me you'll take care of Jake if something happens to me." "Nothing's going to happen to you," Marcus replied, but he squeezed Tommy's hand. "But I promise. He'll be safe." Jake climbed into the helicopter beside his father, but his eyes remained fixed on Benny. "I'll come back," he called out to the injured bear. "I won't leave you alone." As the first helicopter lifted off, carrying Tommy toward the regional trauma center, Marcus felt the weight of responsibility settle on his shoulders. He was now the guardian of both a frightened boy's hopes and a dying bear's last chance at survival. Morrison approached, his phone call finished. "The veterinary team is en route, but they're saying the prognosis isn't good. Too much blood loss, possible internal injuries from struggling against the trap." Marcus knelt beside Benny, placing his hand gently on the bear's massive head. "He's a fighter. He's made it through worse than this." But even as he spoke the words, Marcus could see the life fading from Benny's eyes. The bear who had bridged the gap between human and animal worlds, who had inspired an entire community of forest creatures to choose peace over violence, was slipping away. The other bears seemed to sense it too. They had formed a circle around Benny, their massive forms creating a living cathedral of mourning. Some of the younger bears made soft whimpering sounds, while the older ones stood in silent vigil, their eyes reflecting a depth of emotion that challenged everything humans thought they knew about animal consciousness. Morrison sat heavily on a fallen log, his head in his hands. "This is my fault. All of it. If I hadn't been so obsessed with building something in Elizabeth's memory, none of this would have happened." Marcus looked at the broken man and felt an unexpected surge of compassion. Grief makes us do terrible things sometimes. But it can also make us do great things if we let it. "What do you mean?" "Your daughter, Elizabeth, you said she wanted to be a veterinarian?" Morrison nodded, tears threatening again. "She used to bring home every injured creature she found. Birds with broken wings, cats with cut paws, even a baby raccoon once. She had this gift for helping things heal." Marcus gestured toward Benny and the circle of bears. "Then help this heal. Use your resources, your connections, your power for something Elizabeth would have been proud of." Before Morrison could respond, the sound of approaching rotors announced the arrival of the veterinary team. Dr. Sarah Chen, the lead wildlife surgeon, leaped from the helicopter before it had fully landed, her emergency kit in hand. "Where's my patient?" she called out, then stopped short when she saw the scene before her. My God! I've never seen anything like this. The bears had maintained their vigil even as the helicopter landed, showing no fear of the humans who had come to help their friend. Dr. Chen approached slowly, her movements careful and respectful. "They're protecting him," she whispered in amazement. "They understand that we're here to help." Working quickly but gently, Dr. Chen examined Benny's injuries while Marcus held the bear's massive head steady. "The trap has severed some major blood vessels, but it's also acting as a tourniquet. If we can get him to surgery within the next hour, there's a chance." Morrison stepped forward. "I've arranged for the university's mobile surgical unit to meet us at the helipad. Money is no object. Whatever equipment, specialist, or treatments he needs." Dr. Chen looked up at Morrison with surprise. "You're funding this? Do you understand we're talking about potentially hundreds of thousands of dollars for a wild bear?" "I understand that some things are more valuable than money," Morrison replied quietly. As the veterinary team prepared Benny for transport, something remarkable happened. The massive male bear who had led the earlier confrontation approached Dr. Chen and gently nudged her hand with his snout. Then, as if offering a blessing, he touched Benny's forehead with his own before stepping back to rejoin the circle. "They're saying goodbye," Dr. Chen whispered, her professional composure cracking as she witnessed the depth of emotion in the animals around her. Marcus felt his own eyes burning with unshed tears. He leaned close to Benny's ear and whispered, "You changed everything, old friend. You showed us that love doesn't have boundaries, that family isn't just about blood. Don't give up now." As Benny was carefully loaded onto a specialized transport stretcher, Marcus caught sight of something that made his heart clench. Vance, the contractor who had been struck by the protective male bear, was conscious and being loaded onto a third helicopter under guard. Even from a distance, Marcus could see the man's eyes burning with hatred and promised revenge. Morrison followed Marcus's gaze and his expression hardened. "Vance won't be a problem anymore. I've already spoken with the FBI. He's facing federal charges for conspiracy, attempted murder, and environmental terrorism." "What about the board of directors? The people who ordered this?" Morrison's smile was grim. "They underestimated me. I may have lost my way for a while, but I didn't build a billion-dollar empire by being naive. I've been recording conversations and keeping documentation for years. By tomorrow morning, half the board will be under federal investigation." As the helicopter carrying Benny lifted off toward the University Medical Center, Marcus felt a strange mixture of hope and dread. They had won this battle, but at such a terrible cost. Tommy fighting for his life in a trauma center, Benny clinging to existence by a thread, and Jake caught in the middle of it all, a 12-year-old boy who had already endured more tragedy than most adults. The remaining bears began to disperse as the helicopter disappeared over the tree line, but the massive male lingered. He approached Marcus and Morrison, studied them for a long moment with intelligent eyes, then did something that neither man would ever forget. He bowed his head. It was a gesture of respect, of acknowledgement, of trust. In that moment, Marcus understood that the community Benny had built in these woods would continue without him. The bridge between human and animal worlds would remain, maintained by creatures who had learned that love was stronger than fear. Morrison wiped tears from his eyes. What happens now? Marcus looked around at the forest that had become a battlefield, at the blood-stained ground where so much pain and healing had intersected. Now we wait, we hope, and we figure out how to honor what Benny taught us. As they walked back toward the clearing where the helicopters had landed, Morrison's phone buzzed with an incoming call. He glanced at the screen and his face went pale. "Who is it?" Marcus asked. Morrison showed him the display. Board chairman, priority. They must have heard about what happened here, Morrison said, his voice barely a whisper. They're going to try to salvage the operation, blame everything on me. Marcus felt a chill run down his spine. The victory they had won in the forest might be nothing compared to the battle they were about to face in the boardrooms and courthouses of corporate America. The war for the soul of the forest was just beginning. 3 days later, Marcus sat in the sterile waiting room of Knoxville General Hospital, his weathered hands wrapped around a cup of coffee that had long since gone cold. The antiseptic smell of the hospital brought back memories of his own dark days after the accident, when he'd spent weeks in similar rooms waiting for news that never came. But this time was different. This time, there was hope. Tommy had pulled through the surgery. The bullet had missed vital organs, and while his recovery would be long, the doctors were optimistic. More importantly, Jake had never left his father's side, and Marcus had watched the boy's unwavering faith work its own kind of healing magic on the wounded man. "Mr. Whitfield?" A soft voice interrupted his thoughts. He looked up to see Dr. Chen approaching, still wearing her surgical scrubs, her face unreadable. Marcus's heart stopped. "Benny?" Dr. Chen's exhausted face broke into a smile. "He's going to make it." "It was touch and go for a while. We had to remove part of the damaged tissue, and he'll always have a limp, but he's stable, awake, and asking for visitors." "Asking for visitors?" Marcus laughed despite himself. "How does a bear ask for visitors?" "You'd be surprised. He gets agitated whenever Jake isn't around, calms down the moment the boy walks into the room. I've never seen anything like it in 30 years of veterinary medicine." Marcus felt a weight lift from his shoulders that he hadn't realized he'd been carrying. "Can I see him?" "Of course. But there's something else you should know." Dr. Chen's expression grew serious. "We've had visitors, federal agents, reporters, even some documentary filmmakers. The story of what happened in the forest has gone viral, had Benny. The bear is trending on social media worldwide." Marcus groaned. "The last thing we need is a media circus." "Actually," came a voice from behind them, "it might be exactly what we need." Marcus turned to see Morrison approaching, but this wasn't the broken man from the forest. This Morrison wore a crisp suit and carried himself with renewed purpose. Behind him walked a woman Marcus didn't recognize, tall, professional, with the kind of confidence that came from winning battles in courtrooms. "Marcus, I'd like you to meet Rebecca Torres, my attorney. Rebecca, this is Marcus Whitfield, the man who saved my soul." Rebecca shook Marcus's hand with a firm grip. "Mr. Morrison has told me everything about what happened. We're filing federal charges against the remaining board members, and we're using the media attention to expose the entire conspiracy." Media attention? Marcus felt a familiar dread settling in his stomach. "I don't want Jake or Benny turned into some kind of circus act." Morrison held up his hands. "Nothing exploitative, I promise, but people need to know what happened here. They need to understand that corporate greed almost destroyed something beautiful and irreplaceable." Dr. Chen nodded. "The story has already inspired legislation. Senator Williams is introducing a bill to strengthen protections for wildlife habitats. They're calling it Benny's Law." Marcus shook his head in amazement. "All this because of one bear." "Not just any bear," came a small voice from across the waiting room. Jake was walking toward them, his hand firmly clasped in his father's. Tommy moved slowly, his arm in a sling, but his eyes were bright with determination. "Dad!" Jake ran to Marcus and wrapped his arms around the older man's waist. "Benny's awake. He recognized me. Dr. Chen says I can visit him whenever I want." Tommy approached more slowly, extending his good hand to Morrison. "I owe you an apology, and my thanks." Without your help, Jake and I would have lost everything. Morrison clasped Tommy's hand. You don't owe me anything. If anything, I owe you and your son more than I can ever repay. Actually, Rebecca interrupted, pulling out a thick folder, there might be a way to start. Mr. Morrison's company is establishing a wildlife conservation trust, funded by the settlement money from the lawsuit against the corrupt board members. The trust needs a director, someone who understands both the forest and the animals that live there. She handed the folder to Marcus, who opened it with trembling hands. The salary figure made his eyes widen, but it was the job description that really caught his attention. Chief Conservation Officer, Smoky Mountains Wildlife Preserve. You want me to run a wildlife preserve? Marcus asked. Morrison nodded. 5,000 acres, including the entire area where this happened. It'll be a sanctuary where animals like Benny can live safely, and where people like Jake can learn about the connections between all living things. Jake's eyes lit up like Christmas morning. Does that mean Benny gets to stay? He doesn't have to go back to the wild? Dr. Chen smiled. Actually, we've been discussing that. Benny's injuries mean he'll never be able to survive completely on his own in the wild. But with proper care and a protected environment, he could live comfortably in a sanctuary setting. And, Morrison added, we're planning an educational center where children can learn about wildlife conservation. We'll need junior rangers, kids who understand animals the way Jake does. Tommy looked at his son with pride and concern. It sounds wonderful, but Jake's been through so much. I want him to have a normal childhood. Dad, Jake said seriously, my childhood hasn't been normal since I got sick. But helping Benny, seeing him get better, that makes me feel like maybe being different isn't so bad. Marcus felt his throat tighten with emotion. What about school? Jake needs his education. Rebecca pulled out another document. We've arranged for Jake to be homeschooled by certified teachers who specialize in environmental science. He'll get a better education than any traditional school could provide, plus hands-on experience that money can't buy. As the adults discussed the details, Jake wandered over to the window that looked out onto the hospital's garden. Mr. Marcus, he called softly, come look at this. Marcus joined the boy at the window, and his breath caught in his throat. There, at the edge of the hospital parking lot, was the massive male bear who had protected Benny in the forest. He sat calmly beneath a large oak tree as if he were simply waiting. He's been there since yesterday, Dr. Chen said, joining them at the window. Security tried to scare him off, but he won't leave. It's like he's standing guard. Jake pressed his hand against the window glass. He knows Benny's here. He's making sure his friend is safe. Morrison stood beside them, staring out at the bear with wonder. Elizabeth would have understood this. She always said animals were more loyal than most people. Mr. Morrison? Jake looked up at the man who had once threatened his life and now was offering to transform it. What was your daughter like? Morrison's eyes misted over. She was a lot like you, actually. Brave, kind, always standing up for creatures that couldn't defend themselves. She would have loved Benny. Jake nodded solemnly. I think she would have loved you too. The real you, not the scared, angry you. The simple wisdom of the words hit Morrison like a physical blow. He knelt down to Jake's level, his voice thick with emotion. Do you think... Would you mind if I hung around? Not to interfere, but maybe to learn from you and Benny about being the kind of person Elizabeth would have been proud of? Jake considered this with the seriousness of a judge. I think that would be okay, but you have to promise to be nice to all the animals, not just the cute ones. Morrison laughed through his tears. I promise. As the group continued planning the future of the wildlife preserve, Marcus felt something he hadn't experienced since before the accident, a sense of purpose that extended beyond his own pain. Sarah and Emma would never come back, but their memory could live on in this place, in the work of protecting creatures like Benny, who reminded the world that love transcended species boundaries. "There's one more thing," Dr. Chen said, pulling Marcus aside. "The other bears from the forest, Benny's family, they've been showing up at the hospital too. Not just the big male, but females with cubs, younger bears, even some that look like they came from miles away. It's unprecedented." Marcus wasn't surprised. Word traveled fast in the animal kingdom, especially when it concerned one of their own who had built bridges between worlds. As evening approached, the group made their way to Benny's recovery room. The massive bear lay on a specially constructed bed, his injured leg carefully bandaged, but his eyes bright and alert. When he saw Jake, he made that gentle rumbling sound that seemed to be his way of saying hello. Jake approached the bed and carefully placed his small hand on Benny's massive paw. "Hey, friend, guess what? We're going to be neighbors. You're going to love your new home." Benny's response was a soft huff that sounded remarkably like contentment. Outside the window, the guardian bear still kept his vigil, and Marcus realized that this was just the beginning. They had won more than a battle for a patch of forest. They had proven that love, compassion, and the courage to stand up for what was right could overcome even the darkest human impulses. The future stretched before them, full of promise and possibility. Sometimes the greatest victories come not from conquering others, but from conquering the darkness within ourselves. Marcus found his purpose again through an unlikely friendship with Benny, proving that healing often arrives in the most unexpected forms. Tommy learned that being a good father sometimes means accepting help from others, while Jake showed us that children possess a wisdom about love and forgiveness that we adults often lose along the way. Morrison discovered that true legacy isn't built from monuments to our pain, but from acts of compassion that honor those we've lost. In the end, the Smoky Mountains Wildlife Preserve became more than just a sanctuary for bears. It became a place where broken hearts could mend, where different species could coexist in harmony, and where the simple act of caring for others created ripples of healing that spread far beyond the forest. Benny's story reminds us that it's never too late to choose love over fear, community over isolation, and hope over despair. Every day offers us the chance to be someone's Marcus, to extend a helping hand to a creature in need, and to discover that in saving others, we often save ourselves. What moment in your life taught you the most about unexpected friendship? Have you ever experienced a situation where helping someone else actually helped heal your own heart? Share your stories below. We'd love to hear how compassion has shaped your journey.